a pleasure today to welcome four of the top Washington, D.C. experts on Tunisia specifically, but the MENA region in more general terms, but it's really focusing on Tunisia today. Our topic is, of course, what's been happening in Tunisia since July 25, since the coup of July 25. And what should the U.S. Response be? What should the U.S. Administration and Congress do to help support and restore democracy and defend democracy in Tunisia? As we all know, the situation for human rights and democracy in Tunisia has become alarming, especially in the last couple of weeks, with a lot of arrests of politicians, lawyers and judges and journalists increasing by the day. Since the coup of July 25, Saied, who was elected with the landslide with 72% of the voters because he promised to fight corruption, has in fact not only suspended parliament and the constitution, he has taken control with the support of the military and the Ministry of Interior of all the institutions and all the branches of government in Tunisia, from the executive branch to the legislative branch and the judicial branch. Despite the fact that his support and his popularity have dwindled to less than 10 to maybe 15%, as reflected in the consultation on the constitution a year ago, where only 5% of the Tunisian citizens participated in the consultation, only 5%, and the parliamentary elections in December and January, where only 11% participated. That's if we believe the official results of the EZ that was appointed by Saied himself. So only 11% participated in the recent parliamentary elections, which means that at least 89% of the voters have refused to participate or to take place. Despite of that, he has also refused, he continues to refuse to listen to anyone or to engage in a dialogue with anyone, including the powerful labor union UGTT, which has supported Said's coup against the constitution since July 25. UGTT has launched a new initiative recently, about a month ago, to try to resolve the political crisis in Tunisia. But the president, once again, has refused to listen to this or to enter into this dialogue with the UGTT. And in fact, is also starting a crackdown on the UGTT itself by arresting some of the UGTT leaders and members. So of course, also the economic situation is in free fall, as we all know, and Tunisia could default on its loans within the next couple of months. So in light of all this deteriorating situation, and especially in light of the recent crackdown and the arrests of large number of politicians, lawyers and judges and journalists in the past few days, and the worsening human rights violations in Tunisia, where Saied is accusing his opponents of conspiracy to undermine the security of the state. This is now the charge under which many of the opposition leaders have been arrested in the past few days. So the question is to our panelists, are really three questions that I'd like to start off with. What do you think the U.S. administration, Congress, and the international community as a whole should do, and how should they respond to this deteriorating situation? Secondly, about the IMF loan, it is still on the table, and while there is no question that Tunisia needs this loan to stay afloat economically, there is also no question that it will be seen as supporting the dictatorship and supporting a coup against democracy. And undermining rule of law and democracy in Tunisia and in the Arab world. So what do you think the IMF should go ahead with this loan or not? And under what conditions do you think the IMF loan should be provided? And the third question really is about the role of the army. The army has been playing an increasing role in politics in Tunisia, which is unusual for Tunisia. But since July 25, the army has become increasingly involved in politics. More recently, 3 generals have been appointed as ministers in the government. So this is the first time really since independence that we have generals as ministers in the government. And also the army has provided material support to the coup on July 25, first by closing the parliament with military tanks, and then by continuing to prosecute political leaders and civil society activists, judges and lawyers in military courts. And this is what's really alarming, because most of the trials now going on in Tunisia are in military courts, which do not provide the minimum guarantees for a fair trial. And also is unacceptable and unconstitutional to try civilians in military courts. So the question to the panel today is, what do you think the role of the Tunisian military has been in this coup against democracy? And what do you think the response of the Biden administration and Congress should be about this increasing involvement? So without further ado, we have 4 really excellent panelists and experts on Tunisia. I'm very pleased to welcome all 4 of them today. We have Monica Marks. She's a well-known expert on Tunisia and on Islamic movements, gender and politics in the Middle East in general. Then we have Eric Goldstein. He's the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch, Middle East and North Africa Division. He's an expert on Tunisia and North Africa in general, and has been focusing on human rights in North Africa for at least 30 years. So he's really an expert on human rights in Tunisia and North Africa. Then we have Sharan Goual. He is Assistant Professor of Government at the College of William and Mary, and the non-resident fellow at Brookings Institution, and non-resident fellow at OMED. And he's also an expert on Tunisia and has visited Tunisia many, many times. And I think he has some polling results that he will be discussing today. And finally, we have Shadi Hamid, and Shadi is, of course, a well-known expert at Brookings. He is an assistant research professor of Islamic studies at Fuller Seminary. He has written several books, but his latest book is The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. His earlier book, Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World, and was shortlisted for the 2017 Lionel Gelbert Prize for Best Book on Foreign Affairs. So Shadi is very well written and very well respected in Washington as an expert on Islam and the Islamic world in general, and the problem of democracy in the Arab world. So welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to see you again. We will start with Monica. Each one has about 10 to, let's say, 12 or 14 minutes each. And then we will have about half an hour of Q&A. To our participants, in case we have any participants who do not speak English, I think we have interpretation available today, so you can click on interpretation and listen to our live interpretation into Arabic if you so desire. So again, welcome everybody, and go ahead, Monica, please.
Thanks so much, and thanks to everyone who has attended. I know this has been an absolutely heartbreaking week for a lot of us who watched the MENA region with the Turkey-Syria earthquake, and our bandwidth is limited. So the fact that you guys came out to listen to a panel about yet another depressing set of developments in another MENA country is very valuable and very valued. I think Tunisia has been systematically ignored, which is part of the reason why we find ourselves in this sorry state of affairs. Tunisia, it's sometimes forgot, shockingly, was the first and only Arab country to organically, from the bottom up, create a democracy. Tunisia had 10 years of freedom from the 2011 revolution until Kais Saied made his presidential coup on July 25th, 2021. Its democracy was flawed, fragile, unconsolidated, but it existed and it was real. And its loss is one of the most massive losses for the MENA region of this young century. Since the coup of July 25th, 2021, Kais Saied has been on a long march towards repression. His march has been steady, it's been predictable, but this weekend, we've seen a dramatic upsurge, a dramatic escalation in the level of repression that he's using against critics across the ideological spectrum. Since Saturday, numerous people, we don't have a full list yet, but approximately 20 people, it's thought, have been arrested or abducted from their homes, including the head of Tunisia's largest, most popular, and most important independent media station, Mosaic FM. Also, members of the trade union have found themselves arrested or abducted. Members of Tunisia's main opposition party, Ennahda, have been arrested or abducted, sometimes violently, from their homes since Saturday and earlier. Today, we find ourselves in a situation in Tunisia where 2 out of the 3 top leaders of Ennahda, Tunisia's main opposition party, are in detention. Ali al-Rayed, the number 2 of that party, has been languishing in prison since mid-December, and no Western democracy I'm aware of has made any statement about it. That's part of the reason why Saied feels empowered to move on and to escalate in the way that he's done. Amidst all of this, it's very important to contemplate the role of the European Union and the United States. Those of us who are scholars of North African politics and recent history are very familiar with certain governments in the European Union making security-based or interest-based calculations regarding the Southern Mediterranean, North Africa. They're most often concerned about preventing migration to European shores and preventing terrorism. And based on those 2 sets of calculations, they have often been quite cozy with dictators in North Africa. That's nothing new, it's nothing surprising, especially when it comes to France and Italy. And some would argue that's understandable given their security interests. I would argue it's still a short-termist calculation and not a calculation that serves French or Italian interests, but at least it's more readily understandable. The United States, however, has no clear cross-cutting interests that would necessitate, or even logically argue for necessitating, apologetics for Tunisia's new dictatorship. Tunisia is not relevant for the Israel portfolio. Tunisia is rich in no natural resource that matters for the United States. I have argued that Tunisia, there's no country in the world actually that represents a clearer litmus test of the Biden administration's commitment or lack thereof to democracy than Tunisia. And on this clearest of litmus tests, the Biden administration has signally failed. I want to talk about its messaging first, then I'll move on to areas of cooperation that need to remain paused or be cut. I'll move on to potential carrots, and then a variety of areas in which we might want to consider sanctioning or reviewing the situation. First, the messaging. The Biden administration's messaging has been more pro-dictatorial than the governments of France, Italy, and even, shockingly at times, Russia. I'll mention a few lowlights that I think we all need to be aware of. On April 5th of 2022, last year, as democratically elected MPs in the parliament that Kais Saied shut with army tanks in July 2021 were being dragged before an anti-terrorism unit, our ambassador, the United States ambassador in Tunisia, Donald Blom, allowed himself to be garlanded in a ceremony that was widely photographed in which Kais Saied literally placed an award around his neck. This was just days after democratically elected MPs, dozens of them, were dragged in front of anti-terrorism units. Their crime? Convening parliament, the democratically elected parliament, the only legitimate institution in the country, to meet virtually and denounce Kais Saied's coup. On July 23rd, last year, 2022, just 2 days before Kais Saied forced through a new constitution to replace Tunisia's painstakingly written democratic 2014 constitution, a constitution that he single-handedly authored himself. The United States Embassy in Tunis had nothing to post on its social media except turtle rescue pictures. No statement was made. On December 18th of last year, 2022, just the day after Kais Saied organized the first round of votes for his new Potemkin parliament, an election that was not freely and fairly conducted, an election in which, I kid you not, no political party in the country was allowed to compete. The United States government, the State Department, Ned Price, stated that that election, that farcical election for a sham parliament, quote, represents an essential step towards restoring the country's democratic trajectory. Absurd, insulting to Tunisians across the ideological spectrum. On February 2nd, earlier this month, the second round of those sham elections was held, and the State Department almost copy and pasted its comment from December, despite the loud cries against that wording from myself and, much more importantly, from many Tunisians. The State Department said that those elections represented, quote, another step in the important and essential process of restoring the country's democratic checks and balances. These statements constitute such a radical break from any shred of reality as to rise to the level, I would argue, of diplomatic malpractice. There is a growing recognition in Washington that the Biden administration's messaging has been off, has been worse than almost any other country, certainly than any Western democracy so far. And yet the State Department keeps churning out these statements. The messaging needs to change. The signaling, the symbolism needs to change. There should be no high-level meetings with Kais Saied. There should be no more invitations of Kais Saied to things like the Africa Summit. On the level of signaling and symbolism, the United States needs to be very clear, because in the absence of that, Kais Saied interprets all of these statements as blank checks. These statements are clearing the path for him, at least in terms of foreign policy and international relations, to drag pro-democracy Tunisians of all backgrounds in front of anti-terrorism units, in front of military courts. So we can't really speak out against Kais Saied if we're tacitly enabling him or even applauding him, as the State Department's statements in December and February most certainly did. Right now, the MCC is cut. This is the Millennium Challenge Grant, which is an important vehicle of aid to Tunisia. The MCC's methodology necessitates that it remains cut. The MCC is a reward specifically for democratic improvements. Tunisia has made none. Tunisia is a dictatorship ruled by personal fiat of one man. It has been so since July 25th, 2021. And until that changes, as long as Kais Saied stays at the helm controlling the show, there is absolutely no reason for the United States to intervene, really, to support this new dictatorship in Tunisia by unpausing that grant. I think it's important to recognize that there is a logic of passivity in Tunisia. There is a logic of Cold War thinking that has returned to Washington, that has created a situation where there are actually some on the ground and at the State Department who are doing their best to help Tunisia do enough of a facadical dance for Congress, that Congress restores funds for Tunisia, that things like the MCC get restored. Congress needs to look very skeptically at statements coming from the Biden administration. It needs to understand that there are people who are really trying to unlock that funding because they believe that if the MCC does not come back, Tunisia is going to be vulnerable for geostrategic interference from China and Russia. Now, I think it's worth considering that argument. Because Chinese and Russian interference would be, I think, even less helpful for Tunisia than US interference at this point. But when we really try to weigh the likelihood of that interference and break it down, if if the US stops something like the MCC for good, what is China and Russia going to do in the next year or in the next 10 years? Sit down with me, game it out for me. You'll often see that there's not much there. I think it's a post hoc rationale in search of an argument, really. You know, it's a justification in search of a reason. There is a kind of inertia and muscle memory of keeping a lot of these structures in place. It might even be as simple for some people as they're comfortable in Tunisia and you know, don't want to have bad relations with the government, don't have to pull their kids out of school. But it's very difficult to get hard and fast reasons. The closest thing I've gotten to a Chinese or Russian threat is the idea that at some point within the next decade, China might make a bid for the Rhodes port. And it might use the Rhodes port as a listening center in the Mediterranean. Is that enough of a threat to completely undermine the MCC's methodology and meaning and actively interfere in Tunisian affairs to help aid and abet Kais Saied's new dictatorship? I'm not convinced yet, but if someone has a better argument, I'm very happy to hear it, but I'm not convinced. So I think the MCC obviously needs to remain paused until it sunsets in June, shouldn't come back. I think Tunisia's non-NATO ally status should also be on the chopping block. That's mainly symbolic, but there's no reason why Tunisia under a dictator as erratic, as paranoid, as destabilizing, and in many ways as anti-Western as this one should be a major non-NATO ally. Things that could be potential carrots that there's a real argument for. There should be humanitarian aid. The United States gave humanitarian aid to Tunisia under COVID to help secure food supplies. And USAID can redirect humanitarian aid funds that might have been part of the MCC package towards Tunisia to alleviate some of the desperate economic problems, cost of living problems that Kais Saied's leadership is helping create. There are a set of things that should be under much closer review. I would argue our security funding to Tunisia should be under much closer review. A lot of it came under understandable, justifiable pretense. For example, counterterrorism funding to help Tunisia fight ISIS and jihadism in 2013 to 2015, very understandable. But a lot of that counterterrorism funding now is almost assuredly going to fund the anti-terror units to which so many peaceful people who've simply made critical posts on Facebook, like some of those arrested this weekend, are being dragged as we speak. There's a real likelihood that US and EU money for security and counterterrorism is now being used as an essential pillar of Kais Saied's dictatorship. Kais is using the language, the modalities, and in fact the institutions of counterterrorism and of the military, which the US also partners with and supports through things like military courts, to repress peaceful critics. So there should be intensive review and oversight of all security funding to Tunisia. From what I've heard in Washington, that review does not exist. People might tell you it does, but there's no clear evidence that that's happening. The review should be conducted by the Pentagon, by Congress, and by the State Department. It's important to remember that we're really baby steps away from an Egypt 2013 scenario or from a Ben Ali in the 1990s scenario. We are baby steps at this point, especially after this weekend. There should also be Magnitsky sanctions against the people who are most powerfully aiding Saied. These include the Justice Minister and the Minister of Interior. I'll conclude by saying this. The United States needs to consider unintended consequences of its help, its tacit and explicit help, both rhetorically and financially, for Kais Saied's regime. The United States is not a disinterested or unengaged actor. In fact, it's overly engaged in all the wrong ways right now, both rhetorically and practically. I'm not making an argument here for violating Tunisian sovereignty. Tunisian sovereignty is the most important thing, and I wish that there were Tunisians on this panel. I've spent 4 months in Tunisia interviewing hundreds of people across the ideological spectrum. I've been to Washington, to London, to Paris, interviewing people in government. I've interviewed people in a lot of different embassies. I've been trying to reflect some of their views here. But it's important to recognize that the US is not neutral or disinterested, and that it's actively aiding and abetting Kais Saied at this moment. The US could be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in Tunisia. where it's making come true its very fears of a pro-Russia or pro-China dictatorship. Saied is extraordinarily paranoid. He's very erratic. He has no economic plan. He's highly destabilizing in the southern Mediterranean and regionally. And he's Western alienated in his thought and his rhetoric and his modalities of partnership. There's no reason to believe that any of that's going to change. So it's very important to consider that, with something like an IMF grant, which might very well unlock further funding from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the European Union and the United States might think that they're securing short-term stability in Tunisia, preventing migrants, et cetera, preventing China and Russia from gaining a geostrategic foothold from Washington's perspective. But in actuality, they could be helping prop up his young dictatorship and calcify it in ways that could harm US interests and, most importantly, the Tunisian people for decades to come.
Thank you very much, Monica, for a really very strong and powerful presentation and summary of the recommendations that you are making for the US and European Union and other people who are interested in supporting democracy and on what they should do. We go now to Ricky Goldstein. He's the Deputy Director for MENA region at Human Rights Watch. Go ahead, Ricky. I know you were in Tunis recently, so please tell us, what is the human rights situation in Tunisia?
Thank you, Radwan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I really am excited to be on this panel and to hear the questions and discussion. I also share in the anguish at the effect of the earthquake in Turkey and Syria and other situations in our region that are distracting attention that should go to Tunisia, like the worsening situation in Israel-Palestine, but also the repression in Algeria, which is as severe as it's ever been and is having an impact on Tunisia because of the close relations between the two authoritarian leaders of those countries. But I'm not going to talk so much about the human rights situation, because I think all of us have been following it closely and know it, but to share some impressions on the larger topic today, which is what the US can do. And I'd like to share some historical impressions. And these are really impressions from following Tunisia since I first knew you, Radwan, in the beginning of the 1990s, and talking to American diplomats over the years. So this is not a footnoted paper so much as some impressions that I hope will generate debate and pushback and discussion. Of course, the US foreign policy is not primarily about democracy promotion. Let's get that out of the way. But I'd like to argue that among Middle East and North Africa countries, the US has shown more interest in promoting democracy over the decades in Tunisia than elsewhere. It's limited, but Tunisia stood out. And I think Monica has made a compelling or a troubling argument that that's not the case, that we're now in a situation where the US has an authoritarian regime and is deciding, like it's done in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, let's just stick with a dictator and gently try to nudge him in the right direction. And so that's really, I think, the challenge we have to look at. But in terms of, starting in the 1990s, I think the US took an approach that was slightly nuanced compared to its approach on other authoritarian regimes for a number of reasons. First, as Monica has laid out, the stakes for the US were lower to the US in Tunisia than they were in Egypt, geostrategically. The US, I think, judged Tunisia's political culture more favorably to democracy, as more favorable, more propitious. And also, there was less risk of a hostile regime takeover by a movement that would be inimical to U.S. interests. They looked at the general the human capital in Tunisia and thought, the level of education, the rapport de force between Islamist and non-Islamist parties was more favorable to a democratic transition. They noted the more moderate tenor of Ennahda compared to other Islamist movements in the region. So I was constantly told Tunisia didn't have to be, Tunisia had so much potential. Tunisia had been hijacked by this family. Tunisia can, quote unquote, afford more democracy. Now, again, I am not saying that the US was crusading against authoritarian rule, but there was definitely a distinction between the US approach and, say, the French approach. And on the ground, this was manifested by statements sometimes, but also the fact that in the US Embassy, the US Embassy was constantly sending observers to political trials when no other embassy was doing so. The US was out there in civil society in Tunisia, and Tunisians noted it and appreciated it. And I think this is one of the key objectives of US foreign policy, where you think of democracy promotion as using carrots and sticks to nudge regimes in a certain direction, but it's also of cardinal importance to send signals to civil society, to give encouragement to democratic forces in society. And I think that, in my conversations with human rights activists in Tunisia in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a clear appreciation for the positions that the US took on Tunisia, within limits, of course, at the same time as they deplored US policies on Iraq and US policies on Palestine. And of course, in 2011, the difference between Obama's response to the events, the ouster of Ben Ali, the protest movement before that, compared to the Sarkozy response was very, very much noted. So, the conversations, have evolved over the years. If we look now at the present moments, here we are again with an authoritarian leader ruling in Tunisia, and the question is the U.S. policy again somehow distinct? Does the U.S. government still see Tunisia as having more potential to evolve or to restore democracy than other countries, or are we in a situation where, the U.S. is looking at Saied like another Sisi, where he's the guy we have to support? The U.S. response to events in Egypt has been hugely disappointing. The Biden administration's policies on Saudi Arabia have been hugely disappointing. Are we just going to see another repeat of that, or is there still some hope for a distinct policy toward Tunisia? As Monica has argued, it's been hugely disappointing. I think, though, that in my conversations with policymakers, there is still a distinction, that there still is a hope that, Tunisia is now branded as the last country, Arab Spring country, that has now also gone off the rails. But we're in a different situation in many ways. Most importantly, I think, as people understand, that Saied is not Ben Ali. We have to remember that during at least 2 decades, Ben Ali was regarded as a stable and reliable ally of sorts, and that he was, had firm system in place to maintain his iron fist rule. But I don't think there's any illusion about Said's erratic behavior, his lack of a kind of roots structural roots in going down to the provincial level. He listens to no one. And, we don't need to recite these things. So I think that there is, both a recognition of that, and also that Tunisia is in a far more dire straits economically, and that the match can set off. Having been there in January, and having been disappointed by the scale of protests on January 14th, I'm nevertheless convinced that some police overreach situation in some small town could set things off again. I think that's a real concern for what's going on. And I think also people's expectations have have changed over the since the revolution. So it is, I think, a very different situation than we were in under Ben Ali. So it's all the more disappointing to see the kinds of statements from the U.S. that Monica has mentioned. But I think that the U.S. again has a role to play. Now, I don't want to overstate the U.S. financial aid. It's a pittance compared to the aid that the U.S. shovels out to Israel, to Egypt, to Jordan. It's minor. And the Biden administration, despite the kinds of statements that we heard quoted by Monica, has proposed in the next fiscal year slashing in half from 85 million to 45 million aid to Tunisia. And this is a gesture of dissatisfaction that, even though it's not having a huge financial impact, will be noticed. On the MCC grant, that's a much larger chunk of money. It's $500 million. But the MCC has its criteria on governance and democratization. And it's absolutely clear that Tunisia does not meet those standards. So on those issues, I think that the U.S. positions are going to be sending signals. But I think that the U.S. also, as in the 90s, even if the president doesn't appear, President Saied doesn't appear to listen to statements from Western allies. There is still a very important role that the U.S. can play in reaching out to civil society, to many contacts across the spectrum, inside the government, inside the administration, inside the military, inside civil society, with the parties as well, provincial government, across the spectrum, because it's very, I think, useful for the U.S. to signal its values in this way. It should also not be flummoxed, and I think it was flummoxed initially by the support that Saied seemed to have both at the election, which is incontestable, and at the time of his self coup in July of 2021. I think the U.S. Was hesitant to be driving too hard a message, fearing that the Tunisian people were solidly supportive of Saied, and that I think the date of expiration on that kind of hesitation has long expired. The miserable participation rates in the elections since then, the legislative elections, is one indicator. We have to also remember the state of fear that is set in Tunisia with all these arbitrary arrests and intimidation of people. So people are not pouring into the streets, but the U.S. should stand up for its values. And it's clear that the country's headed in a very, very negative direction right now. So it can find ways to express that dissatisfaction without fearing that, people are still with Saied, so we don't know quite how to word this. I think it's clear. So just to conclude, the U.S. should be speaking out publicly. It should reinforce its contacts. Monica mentioned, the opportunities for providing humanitarian aid to Tunisia. It might, you mentioned during the COVID period, but there are, going to be continuing shortages, and the U.S. can play a role there in showing its solidarity with the Tunisian people. But I think that Tunisia right now maybe is faltering badly, but it remains the best hope for an Arab Spring country to get back on a democratic track. And I think the U.S. should continue to regard it as such. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric, again for an excellent presentation. We now go to Sharan Gruan. Go ahead, Sharan, and welcome.
Thank you, and thank you, Redwan, for organizing, and thank you, everyone, for coming. It's very difficult to go after Monica and Eric, who are really two real experts on Tunisia, who know it well and who have been following it very closely. But let me try to speak to some of the assumptions that I think are driving U.S. foreign policy towards Tunisia, and try to question or challenge some of those underlying assumptions. So if we look back in the last year and a half, the US never applied as much pressure as it could have on Kais Saied, but in recent months, the US seems to be giving up almost entirely on putting pressure. The most recent statements that the US put out, as Monica noted, praised these parliamentary elections as an essential step towards democracy, despite these elections having some of the lowest turnout that the world has ever seen. They're clearly not a step towards democracy, or for that matter, towards stability, if there's only 10% trust in these institutions that he's creating. But if we look back 6 months before these statements, the US did seem to be on the right track. In the weeks right after the referendum last July, in late July, early August, the US did put out a number of very critical statements in rapid succession. You had Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, you had Joey Hood during his confirmation hearing, and then maybe most importantly, you had the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. All three of them made very critical statements of Kais Saied and the path he's taking Tunisia in rapid succession. And the last one by Lloyd Austin really did scare some folks in Tunisia. I heard from a number of contacts that one really got their attention because it signaled that maybe US military aid was actually on the line, and that more generally it signaled that this seemed to be at least a coordinated whole of government approach from the US to ramp up criticism of Tunisia. And so those statements in those weeks, late July, early August, seemed to make an effect. Now, you could say that statements don't do very much. It's just a statement from the US. And you're right that statements from the US are not going to change the attitudes of Tunisians who strongly support Kais Saied. A statement from the US is not going to change their support. Likewise, it's not going to change the attitudes of the Tunisians who are openly, strongly opposing Kais Saied. They're going to do that regardless of a US statement. But where US statements could have an effect is among the Tunisians who are in the middle, who are either neutral towards July 25th, or who are not willing to share their opinion. Perhaps they oppose it, but are not willing to say it. It's among this segment of society that US statements could have an effect, emboldening them to be open about their opposition, or even swaying their attitudes if they're truly on the fence. But the response of Kais Saied to those strong statements from the US in late July, early August, seemed to scare the US into backing off. That response of Kais Saied was to publicly call out the US's statements, paint them as being foreign interference in Tunisian affairs. The UGTT likewise called it foreign interference. A number of other small parties did as well. And perhaps just as Kais Saied wanted, the US backed off, went silent for the next 3 months, and then went on to praise these latest elections. And the US, in my mind, made two assumptions when it decided to go silent at that point. The first was that if Kais Saied is going to paint our statements as foreign interference, then they'll no longer be effective in swaying Tunisian public opinion, especially among those who are neutral or in the middle. That the statements won't be effective if they're painted as foreign interference. And secondly, even worse for the US, it might create a backlash against the US, fuel anti-American sentiment that we are meddling in Tunisian affairs. Those two assumptions are testable. You can look at public opinion and see what happens when US statements are painted as foreign interference. And so I tried to do that, to try to test these assumptions in a survey I conducted of Tunisians in September of last year. And I want to share two quick slides that show some results from that survey. So the survey I conducted was in September of last year. It was a nationally representative face-to-face survey of 1,200 Tunisians that one-to-one for research and polling, one of the most reputable firms in Tunisia, the one that does the Eurobarometer and the Afrobarometer, conducted. And what I added into the survey was a survey experiment where half of the sample was primed to remember this exchange where several American officials expressed their concerns with the democratic path in Tunisia, and President Kais Saied then rejected these as foreign interference. And we can then compare those half of the sample that are reminded to think about this to a control group who is not reminded about what happened, to see what effect it had. And so the first assumption is that if these statements are painted as foreign interference, then they're not going to have any effect. And so the question I asked was, in your opinion, is Tunisia experiencing democratic backsliding? And we would think that these US statements might have an effect among those who are somewhat neutral or don't know their attitudes towards July 25th. And so here in this figure, I've divided the sample into those who earlier in the survey said they strongly support July 25th, those who said they oppose July 25th, and then those who said they don't know what they think about July 25th. And what you see is that reminding Tunisians of these US statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, didn't have any effect among those who support the coup, likewise among those who openly oppose the coup. But they did have an effect among those who were neutral or said don't know what they think about July 25th. There, if you reminded them about the US's statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, you saw a significant increase in the percent of people who are saying there has been democratic backsliding in the last year. It almost doubled the percent of people who said there is some democratic backsliding. So the takeaway there is that US statements, even when they're painted as foreign interference, seem to still work. There does seem to be an increase among people willing to say that there has been backsliding among this segment who are neutral or say don't know initially. Then the second assumption is whether there might be a backlash, that the US is seen as meddling in Tunisian affairs. So here I asked a second question. Moving forward, do you think Tunisia should reduce or improve its relations with the United States? And if there is a backlash, we should see fewer Tunisians saying we want to improve relations with the United States. But what we see among all three of these groups is no effect. There doesn't seem to be any backlash. There is a slight reduction for each of these groups in the percent who are saying they want to improve relations with the US, but none of this is statistically significant. There is no difference in the attitudes among those who are reminded that the US made these statements that were painted as foreign interference. In short, there doesn't seem to be any backlash in public opinion against the US when it makes these statements. So in short, both of these assumptions that seem to lead the US to go silent don't seem to hold in this survey, that in fact, US statements might still have an effect and don't generate any sort of backlash. Now, the third major assumption that I think has driven the US to go relatively silent is the one that Monica touched on about China and Russia. That maybe if the US is too critical, if it suspends aid, that it might leave a void for China and Russia to fill. But I think we can respond in two ways. One is that if China and Russia were truly going to jump in and provide aid to Kais Saied, they would have already done it, and they are going to do it either way. Us giving US assistance to Tunisia is not going to stop Kais Saied from exploring other options. Even Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, that the US gives a lot of aid to and praise to, even they still explore outside options from China and Russia and praise, for instance, the war in Ukraine, or don't actively condemn it. And so if you think about Tunisia as well, Kais Saied in particular has said on multiple occasions that he doesn't want to ally with any one side. Even in the preamble of the constitution, he said that Tunisia is not going to align with any one side. And so the US giving aid to Kais Saied is not going to stop him from exploring other options. Providing money doesn't create a strong, committed ally. It just creates an ally who's willing to sell out to the highest bidder. Instead, the only way you would get a country to reliably ally with the US against China and Russia is through a shared commitment to democracy and human rights, values that distinguish the US from China and Russia. In short, if you want Tunisia to reliably ally with the US should do its best to help restore democracy. It's through that shared commitment that they would reliably ally with the US. So let me close with a couple of remarks on what I think the US could do beyond strong statements that I think I've shown would have an effect. The second is to think about US assistance to Tunisia. Monica did a good job laying out all the different potential pools of funding there. And I think it's important that they are all framed as carrots rather than sticks, that Tunisia would get this assistance on any of these funds if it agrees to a national dialogue and restoring democracy. Framing them as carrots can help in terms of this aid suspension. My guess is that the US is not willing to fully suspend aid, and instead, therefore, repurposing some of the aid can be helpful. The economic assistance can be repurposed, for instance, directly to the people as humanitarian assistance rather than going to the regime. With regards to military aid, the proportion that we may perhaps continue to give to Tunisia, that in my mind should be repurposed towards two elements. One is to hold some dialogues and discussions within the Tunisian military about what professionalism means. When we think about what happened on July 25th, the military was given an order from the commander-in-chief that maybe they had some doubts about whether this is constitutional or not, but they didn't have any channel to refer it to. There's no legal channel for them to refer it to courts to then see was this order we're given legal or not. And so instead, the military thought, as professionals, we should obey what the commander-in-chief told us and follow through. And I think having some discussions about what professionalism really entails, about not following orders that are questionable, that have some constitutional questions can be helpful. And I think in those discussions, it would be useful for the US military to be talking about what they were thinking on January 6th, about whether professionally they would be allowed to defend the Congress even against the wishes of the president. Those sort of discussions about what professionalism entails in these crisis moments, I think can be very useful moving forward for getting the Tunisian military to respond differently in moments like that. The second and related aspect is to set up some sort of office of general counsel within the Ministry of Defense, that the top officers can refer an order that they don't know if it's legal or constitutional. They can refer it to lawyers within the Ministry of Defense for them to weigh in on, rather than military officers having to decide the constitutionality themselves, something they're not qualified to do so. Setting up an office like that, like the US has, for instance, can be useful moving forward. There might also be a role for the Department of Justice in the US to help set up an office like that. Finally, let me just make one small point before I close, which is that all of these steps, strong statements, the suspending of aid, these sorts of dialogues with the military, maybe they won't actually change Kais Saied's behavior and help restore democracy in Tunisia. But they are still important to pursue in terms of sending a signal to the region moving forward, to the world moving forward, about what happens if a populist leader takes a move like this, that there is real consequences, that in turn might prevent some headaches for the US moving forward, even if it doesn't resolve this headache today for the US in Tunisia. All right, let me stop there. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Sharan. And we'll come back to some questions, especially on the role of the military, since I know that you have studied this topic closely, I would say, in the last couple of years. And the role of the military in Tunisia, the increasing role that they are playing in politics. I have some questions about that we'll come back to it later. But let's conclude our presentations with the final presentation by Dr. Shadi Hamid. Shadi, you've been watching Tunisia, watching the Middle East and North Africa for at least 20 years now. And where do you think Tunisia is headed, and where do you think US policy towards democracy in the region is headed?
Great. Thanks, Ridwan, for having me. So let me not mince words. Let's get right to the point. I think that the Biden administration is the worst US administration on democracy in the Middle East since the 1980s, with the partial exception of the Trump administration for obvious reasons. But I think it is worth just really emphasizing what an unusual administration this is in terms of the expectations they raised about prioritizing democracy and moving in a more positive direction. And they have done some of that in other regions of the world. The Middle East is an almost complete exception to this pro-democracy strategy. So I think there's two ways of reacting to this unfortunate fact. We can think about short-term options, and we've discussed some of them already, and I think there still is time to act, and anything is possible. And we can imagine a scenario where some in the Biden administration can be persuaded to do more than they've been doing. And I'll say a couple things about that, and then I'll move on to the medium to long term, because I think that, there's a good chance Tunisia will continue its slide towards dictatorship. And then we have to think about what the long-term possibilities are and how to steel ourselves for that longer battle for democracy. So short term, we've touched on it, but I want to really put a fine point on it. There is one incredibly powerful piece of leverage. But for this to work, the US and its European partners would have to act almost immediately. Time really is running out, and that's the IMF loan. And just yesterday, the IMF's managing director, Kristalina Georgieva, said, quote unquote, that she expects to see in the next weeks, not months, a conclusion of the remaining actions so we can go to the board for the final agreement. So as some of you might know, the provisional agreement was in October, but they've been working through a number of outstanding issues. And as of yesterday, we're talking about the IMF loan actually being finalized in the matter of weeks, which is to say, for any of you who are on this call, who have any, relationships, friendships, and connections with people, IMF, World Bank, the US, this is probably the time to act. Now, the US is very important here. In the IMF Articles of Agreement, there is nothing about political conditionality. The IMF is empowered to work with both democracies and autocracies. So that's the way it is. But there's nothing in the Articles of Agreement that say that political concerns can't be used in considering whether or not a loan goes through. And in fact, the irony of this is that the IMF and the World Bank, when Egypt was very briefly a flawed democracy in 2013, in effect suspended talks for a loan agreement because Mohamed Morsi, the first elected president of Egypt, whatever else you think about him, wasn't being inclusive enough. So when Egypt was moving in a democratic direction, the IMF insisted on political conditionality. When Egypt became a dictatorship, all of that went away and the IMF jumped to support Sisi. Just think about the irony there. And let's also talk about the numbers in Egypt, and I'll come back to Tunisia. From 2016 to 2022, the IMF has given Egypt more than $20 billion of loans. And then 2023, the new IMF agreement is another $3 billion. This is a massive amount of money. And I think we should just say it outright. The IMF is not just perceived as supporting dictators in the Middle East. It is an active enabler and subsidizer of dictatorship. It is playing a nefarious role, and it's clear for everyone to see. And we should no longer treat the IMF and the World Bank as sort of neutral above the fray actors. They are pro-authoritarian in a very explicit way in the Middle East. And they have allowed the Sisi regime to stabilize itself and to consolidate its power in a very difficult economic situation. Now, the current IMF deal that is about to go through in Tunisia, how much are we talking about here? It's $1.9 billion for 48 months. Tunisia has about 1/10 of the population of Egypt. So if we think about what the equivalent is, it is akin to a $20 billion IMF loan to Egypt, but in 2 years, not 6. So in some ways, on a per capita basis, this is an incredibly large IMF bailout. So what do we do with all that information? The US and European countries are the IMF's largest shareholders. It is not traditional practice, but it is entirely possible and within the Biden administration's power to use its voting rights in the IMF to compel IMF officials to pause on these final talks. It can be done. It's doable. There's nothing preventing the US, ideally with coordination with European countries, from considering this maximal option. Because what I do think we need is the maximal option. I'm all for what my fellow panelists have suggested. They can help along the margins, maybe even more than that. But in terms of actually compelling a change of behavior, because, you know, in a very basic level, Tunisia needs this emergency bailout. It's in very dire economic straits. It is at the risk of a historic default. Now, do I have much hope that Saied is a rational actor? No, I don't. What I do have hope, and what I very much believe to be the case, is that Said's allies understand how important it is to receive this IMF support. And the goal then should be to isolate Saied and to try to peel off his allies in the military, in the security services. And the military, as we've been talking about in Tunisia, has become politicized. It has played an active role in consolidating this new authoritarian state. And they're the ones that we should be thinking more and more about. Okay, so that's on that. On US aid, the bilateral aid, which we've also talked about, and as Eric and others have said, it has been cut in half. I am actually not a big proponent of halfway measures on US aid. And in some ways, I think it's a wash. I don't even see it really as progress, because when you cut aid by half, but there's still a lot of aid continuing, It is quite literally the definition of a mixed message. We tried a partial aid suspension in Egypt after the massacre in 2013. It had no effect, and rightfully so, because Sisi understood what a partial aid suspension is. It's a weak measure. It shows that the US, its heart isn't in it. It wants to give the illusion of doing something on democracy, but isn't willing to follow through on its commitment to any logical end. And with partial aid cuts, they don't actually last long because they're usually not effective. Because they don't, because the message isn't clear and the conditions aren't clear. And anyway, more can be said on that, but I am skeptical of how useful that's going to be, which is since last year, I've been calling more explicitly, including in an op-ed in the Post with Sharon quite a while ago now, that a full aid suspension has to be considered as a last-ditch measure. Now, you might say, well, oh, then what happens if the Tunisians don't bend and then we have a breach in the relationship? This is always the thinking, though, that we use when it comes to Middle East dictators. So whenever we talk about a full suspension of military assistance to Saudi Arabia, which I've also been an advocate for, we could ground the Saudi military in the matter of weeks if we did a full immediate suspension of spare parts and maintenance, because they wouldn't be able to run their jets and tanks without that after a certain period of time. Well, then people would say, well, what if the Saudis refuse to bend to whatever demands we might have? Then we're stuck. There is a risk when you use leverage, and we should be forthright about that. But at a fundamental level, these regimes need us much more than we need them. And for us to always act like we're the ones who are the weaker party, that we're the ones who are so afraid of what might happen, when we are the ones who provide a security umbrella to many of these Arab dictatorships. We subsidize their repression. It's really worth emphasizing that this is not about neutrality. And in Tunisia today, as Monica said, we are subsidizing the very units, the very agencies and departments that are actively repressing their own people as we speak. The last thing I'll just say on in broader terms, as I close here, Tunisia was where it was supposed to work. And we've alluded to this. It's not the main topic of this conversation, but it is worth remembering that one of the reasons we were optimistic about Tunisia was that the Islamist party there and Nahda did pretty much everything you could imagine to make concessions to secular and liberal parties. It gave up most of its ideological commitments, so much so that its rank and file was grumbling and has been grumbling for many years now. And the bet that the Nahda leadership made was that if they do this, if they try to be as conciliatory as possible to other Tunisian political actors, that this would be a way to safeguard the democratic transition. I was skeptical of that approach, and actually Sharon and I wrote a pretty long paper that came out in 2020. It's called The Dark Side of Consensus in Tunisia. If any of you want to check it out on Brookings' website and get the full argument. But there was a dark side to what was happening, which was everything was about consensus. Everything was about a national unity government. It led to a lot of gridlock. And that, in part, is what allowed Saied to come and say, the establishment isn't getting anything done. Look, they just care about staying in power, their own political interests. But still, Nahda deserves a lot of credit for what it tried to do, and I understood and understand why they chose that course. But if Ennahda's approach didn't actually work and the Brotherhood's much more aggressive, confrontational approach in Egypt didn't work, it is an interesting question. Like, what are these political parties and movements supposed to do if everything they tried seems to lead to a similar result? But that's really why Tunisia, still is a chance. And I think that's a big part of why there should be renewed focus right now at this very moment. From anyone who cares, from anyone who's interested, to actually try to maybe not restore democracy altogether, but to try to right the path, to get Tunisia on a path where it's at least moving in a better direction. And the last thing I'll say is there is a lot of work for the opposition to do in Tunisia. This is a bigger conversation, but one of the major roadblocks is that the opposition forces, they agree on one thing, that they don't like Saied, but because of an Islamist secular divide, to oversimplify a little bit, but because there is still profound distrust, particularly towards Ennahda, that there's an inability for them to come up with a roadmap. So I've often gotten this question from interlocutors in the US government and elsewhere that, okay, Shadi, what is the alternative to Saied? We don't even know what the opposition wants. They haven't presented a clear path forward. They don't even agree on basic things about returning to the previous parliament. And at some level, there has to be a renewed focus on the part of the Tunisian opposition to find a way to unite their ranks and to transcend what has hobbled them for the last 10 years to one degree or another, which is this divide and this distrust of Ennahda, and what I think is a kind of paranoid and unjustified fear of Ennahda. How do you do that? What can Ennahda do to reassure its potential partners? How can civil society organizations here in the US and elsewhere who work in the Middle East, how can they try to encourage their secular counterparts, secular civil society, secular political parties, to try to find a way to work more effectively with Ennahda? These are all things that I think we're going to have to think very seriously about going forward. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shadi. Thank you to all our panelists. I think you have all made very, very strong and powerful presentations about not only the dire situation in Tunisia, a year and a half after the coup of July 25, but also on what the US policy should be and what it has been, which to summarize, I think most of you, is that it has been a real disappointment, given that Tunisia was so close to achieving the dream of democracy in the Arab world, was so close to becoming a real democracy and a working, functioning democracy. Still had problems. Still, the work was not done for sure. Still problems economically, in particular. The pandemic made the economic situation a lot worse. I was there in 2020 and 2021, and you can feel the economic collapse really that happened during the pandemic, certainly the first year. I want to mention the case of Khiyam Turki. Khiyam Turki is a politician. He is secular but not anti-Nahda. He's secular but willing to dialogue with Ennahda. And he's been involved for the last 7 months in organizing meetings between opposition leaders, just on the point that you mentioned, Shadi, to try to unite the opposition and develop a roadmap for democracy. Well, he was arrested last Saturday. And the charge against him is conspiracy against the security of the state for two things: for organizing these meetings between opposition leaders, and many of these meetings were in his home, and also for meeting with two US diplomats, you know, that apparently he had lunch or dinner with two US diplomats who, you know, were interested to know what was going on in Tunisia. These are the charges now, and we have not heard a single statement from the Biden administration yet on his arrest. And it's been 5 days since Saturday. Many other politicians have been arrested. Nourdine Lebhiri is undergoing surgery right now, full anesthesia surgery, and his health is really deteriorating because he was beaten during his arrest. They broke his elbow, and it was untreated since his arrest, and so now he's undergoing surgery. And it's still no statement from the Biden administration about these arrests, about these violations of human rights, and many of them were arrested, of the other politicians were arrested for simply putting Facebook posts for their opinions on Facebook, calling it a coup, or calling for the opposition to unite against the coup. Now that has become, or Qais Saied wants to make it a crime, punishable by 5 to 10 years of jail for posting something on Facebook or on Twitter. This is the level that Tunisia has become 1.5 years after the coup, and still no statement to this day from the State Department or the National Security Council or the White House or even Congress, for God's sake, about these really severe violations. So I think the situation is really, really alarming, and I think the United States really needs to review its policies towards the Qais Saied regime. The policy of half-baked criticism and half-baked pressure has obviously not worked for the past 1.5 years, and as you put it, Shadi, cutting the assistance in half has not worked. The situation has gotten worse and worse every day, and I think the US needs to really revamp and review and change its policy and put a lot more pressure on Qais Saied and also on the Tunisian military. I think the Tunisian military will never jeopardize their relationship with the US military and with the US government, because it's a long-standing relationship that has been over 50 years since independence. They have a huge relations, huge interests with the US military, and they're not willing to jeopardize that. And all we're asking them to do is to stay out of politics. That's all. We're not asking them to remove Qais Saied or to organize a coup against Qais Saied or anything like that. Just go back to your barracks and stay as a professional Republican army should be out of politics. That's the way it has been since independence. But now they're getting into politics, and I think the US needs to issue very clear statement, even more clear than the statement that the Secretary of Defense issued last, I think, June or July. It has to be very clear that this is totally unacceptable. And again, the US administration still has not made that statement and has not made that clear reference to the Tunisian military must step out of politics, must stay out of politics. Okay, we're going to take about 15, maybe 20 minutes of questions. If you have questions, you can ask in Q&A. So we're going to give priority to Q&A first. The first question by Mansaf Khadr: if one takes into consideration US foreign policy vis-a-vis Egypt since 2013, then what to expect from US foreign policy regarding Tunisia since July 2021? So I guess it's about the similarity or the differences between Egypt and Tunisia and the response of the US government. Another question from Kevin Coyne is, what role should the UGTT play right now? You know, what is the role of the UGTT and what role can they play or should they play right now? So let's answer those two questions and then we will move on to other questions. Anybody wants to answer one of these two questions? Comparisons with Egypt and the role of UGTT.
I can say something on the comparison with Egypt, but Sharon's actually done a lot of, I want to just make sure Sharon says something about it too, because he's done a lot of good comparative work on Egypt and Tunisia and their militaries. But, you know, from my standpoint, so many of the people who were involved in Obama's Egypt policy and Middle East policy, which I think we're all pretty critical of, have returned and play some role in the Biden administration. So, you know, one way of looking at it is that there is some continuity. And the sense that I get, you know, from a number of folks I've talked to in State and the NSC over the past year or two, is what I remember from the Obama administration, this sense of exhaustion with the Middle East, this sense that almost verges on a certain way of looking at Arabs. It's not usually explicit, but it is a version of, look, we tried with you guys in the early part of the Arab Spring, you know, then there was civil war and all this other stuff and millennia old conflict. Some of you might remember in his State of the Union in 2013, I believe, Barack Obama explicitly said this. He was pretty much like, you know, raising up his hands and saying, millennia old hatreds. That is what is going on in the Middle East. So this is not just my interpretation of what they think. They've actually sometimes also said it outright. The kind of de facto director of Middle East policy in the Biden administration is a big part of the problem. He was also there under Obama. You know, I don't like naming names, but I do think that, you know, without him changing his approach to the Middle East, so I'm talking about Brett McGurk here, who's the National Security Council coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa. Smart, competent guy in many ways, but he does not, let me put this nicely, he doesn't really believe in democracy in the Middle East. And my hope is that, you know, that at some point there could be someone new in that position. Certainly if there's a Democratic administration 2024 onwards, I think a top priority for pro-democracy advocates is to make sure Brett McGurk doesn't get a senior position on Middle East policy. And the reason that he runs Middle East policy right now and has very little pushback is because Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, again, a very smart, even brilliant guy, doesn't care about the Middle East. That he doesn't care about democracy in the Middle East. He's never going to focus on it. He's not going to put pressure on Brett McGurk to do more. So in some ways, I feel like it's partly a personnel problem, and that's just worth keeping in mind. And I think all of us who work in this space need to think much more carefully about how we can organize and prepare ourselves for 2024 in terms of trying to encourage and support better officials in these key positions.
Okay, Sharon?
Sure. So let me talk a bit about the military. Certainly the response of the US to Egypt 2013 and July 2021 for Tunisia are similar in terms of trying to maintain military assistance. And that's a normal response from the US, and both due to inertia of trying to maintain what you've done before, but especially for security assistance, it's very easy for DoD as well as others to make the argument that security cooperation trumps all other values, that's most important in our relationship. And especially for some of these military training programs, the argument is always very compelling within the administration that we must preserve our relations and our contacts because those relationships are going to help us moving forward. And so there's always a tendency not to suspend military assistance, even when it's explicitly a coup, like in Egypt 2013, and certainly when it's less clear, like in July 2021. There is, of course, an important difference, right? July 2021 was not a military coup. The military was certainly involved, and they helped to close the parliament. They've been holding these military trials, but it was not a military coup at its core. It was a presidential coup. And so that in turn does show some differences also in terms of the Tunisian military's behavior as opposed to Egypt's. On the one hand, we would have thought its professionalism, its apolitical professionalism would mean it wouldn't obey and close the parliament. But as I mentioned earlier, the parts of its professionalism that it knows best, which is to defer to the president, to obey his orders, to try to stay out of political matters, all of those pushed it actually to obey this order, to defer to the president that, yeah, it's probably constitutional, to think that explicitly refusing would have been a more political action. All of that, its professionalism, and therefore led it to obey and close the parliament. And that's why I think it's important to have these discussions within the Tunisian military about what professionalism actually means moving forward. But the other major reason why the Tunisian military obeyed and closed the parliament, and this here is a similarity with Egypt, is that there was some gains to be had in terms of its corporate interests. That Kais Saied was advancing the military's interests, continuing to increase the budget, for instance, despite COVID, when you might have expected the budget to instead go to the Ministry of Health, to appoint military doctors as the Minister of Health, more generally to give the military regular access to the president, political access that it did not have previously. All of that led it to think that its gains are going to be advanced even further if it supports this coup. And they were proven right to some extent. Now you see a general appointed as Minister of Agriculture, you see the budget increasing further, you see the political influence of the military growing even further. And so in that sense, there are gains that the military is having. But there are also some costs, and this is important. There are costs in terms of its image, domestically and abroad. At home, some Tunisians are waking up and realizing the Tunisian military is not the neutral professional military they thought it was. It does seem to be taking sides. And the Tunisian military doesn't like their image being tarnished. And so if that increases moving forward, that could shift the military's behavior. But I don't think it's going to increase, because the main thing that's tarnishing the Tunisian military's image, which is the military tanks around the parliament, that's soon going to go away. Once this new parliament takes office, that's going to be reopened, and you won't visibly see the military defending Kais Saied's coup anymore. And so instead, the cost that I think could possibly increase is the one about its international image, and in turn the potential break with relations or reduction in relations with the US moving forward. And so that, I think, gives the US some leverage, and maybe is the only leverage that could switch the Tunisian military's calculations moving forward, that there must be a real threat that military aid will be cut in half for sure, repurposed perhaps, but really on the line fully, given, as Monica noted, the use of these counterterrorism institutions, but language as well in terms of justifying the crackdown that's occurring today. Those costs, the foreign costs, are really the only ones I think could switch the Tunisian military moving forward.
Okay. Eric or Monica, anything on the UGTT and the role of the UGTT?
If it was okay with you, I had about like 3 or 4 points that I was going to make that would respond to a lot of the questions that have come in on the chat box simultaneously. I'm happy to do that now or whenever you want me to.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, we still have another 5 or 10 minutes, but go ahead. You can start.
Okay. I'll just add one thing to what Shadi and Sharon have said on Egypt, which is to reprise a comment from my initial remarks. We had a lot of reason historically and geostrategically to predict the United States would resume its support for dictatorship in Tunisia. In Egypt, sorry. But in Tunisia, we had no such reasons. The US has typically been comparatively unsullied when it comes to supporting dictatorships in Tunisia. And like I said, it doesn't have any clear cross-cutting interests there. Be it petrol, oil, or support for Israel, whereas Egypt has been one of the top recipients of US foreign aid for decades now. So there does not exist a clear litmus test for the Biden administration's support for democracy abroad or lack thereof in Tunisia, and it's been making the wrong choices. When it comes to UGTT, if UGTT decided tomorrow to pick up the phone and call all of the political parties and major civil society movements opposed to Kais Saied's regime, it could be the standard bearer of the cross-ideological opposition coalition that we've all been waiting for. But it has not done that because of what Hamel Hamami, the Tunisian Marxist leftist, said to me in a great interview. He called it in the summer of 2021, the Ennahda syndrome. That Shadi had alluded to. And it's this Ennahda syndrome, this paranoia about this almost visceral revulsion against working with Ennahda that's preventing UGTT from doing that. UGTT has itself experienced a move towards authoritarianism inside the union with the leadership of its current Secretary General Nourdine Taboubi, who is also a lot more focused on consolidating his own unilateral control of the labor union than he is in taking up that 2015 Nobel Prize mantle again. UGTT was a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize during Tunisia's democratic transition and putting the interest of the country first, which is very disappointing, but not surprising for close observers of UGTT over the past decades. I wanted to say something about the IMF aid, potential IMF deal. I would add that an IMF agreement with Kais Saied under these circumstances is actually against the IMF's own interests. If what the IMF wants to see is clear neoliberal economic reforms in Tunisia, or any kind of return on investment. Kais Saied is not your garden variety dictator. He is not a Ben Ali. He is an ineffective authoritarian who's running what I have termed an adhocracy. In other words, he's making it up as he goes along. He's chaotic, he's quixotic, he's erratic, and he's paranoid. And he has proven himself signally unable to build stakeholdership in his new dictatorship, signally incapable of working with UGTT, which was an initial cheerleader for his coup. He's not even managed to bring them on board, to bring them around the table. So I'm not sure why anyone in this circumstance would imagine that Kais Saied, of all ineffective, erratic authoritarians, that Kais Saied, who appears so often to be like an old man tying and untying his shoelaces or tinkering with a toy train set in an attic, incapable of building stakeholdership, incapable of doing a Ben Ali 1989 national pact and bringing around the initial cheerleaders around the table, why would anyone in this circumstance think that he could be the person to force through quite unpopular, quite hard to swallow IMF demands? What the IMF deal represents is a short-termist stability vote for Europe to keep the migrants away. And I call it short-termist because I think it's essentially throwing money down the toilet, because Kais Saied is not a person with an economic plan or who can build buy-in with these hard reforms. He's going to be even more of a money sieve, even more of a colander than Sisi in Egypt. Sisi has been such a colander for the IMF, the pit into which just more and more money falls, the gift that keeps on asking, that he has actually managed to annoy the Saudis, who have conditioned their own package of support for Sisi on the comfort of an IMF deal, which Egypt recently got, which then unlocked the Saudi aid. Which brings me to another point. If and when Tunisia gets an IMF deal, not only is it going to be short-termist, not only is it going to set Tunisia up as a continued expensive aid recipient and help prolong this destabilizing, I would argue, inevitability of Kais Saied's collapse. It's just going to prolong the pain on some analytical level, but it's also going to likely unlock Gulf aid. One of the great counterintuitive mysteries of Kais Saied's young dictatorship is that neither the UAE nor Saudi Arabia, which have been quite keen to support counter-revolutions in the Arab world, have bailed him out yet. And it's actually been, and this is very surprising, but I've confirmed this amongst a variety of sources, it's actually been various European Union countries and the United States government that have gone tin cupping to Riyadh and Abu Dhabi asking for a bailout. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, to their credit, are getting a little bit more discerning about where they put their money because of their bad experience with Sisi. He's been very expensive. Sisi has been a much more reliable ally for Riyadh and Abu Dhabi than Kais Saied ever will be. He's no Ben Ali. A lot of people wish he was. Amongst them, I think, are the US government, the European Union, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, but he's not. He is an agent of destabilization. So they have conditioned their support on the comfort of an IMF deal. So we also have to consider, the IMF also needs to consider here that granting Tunisia a deal might unlock, in particular, Saudi aid, which is going to set up, it's going to open the floodgates potentially for new external incentives and dictatorial tutelages to emerge that are going to lock the Tunisian people in a system of external interference that's going to be horrible, likely, for their ability to express and attain political freedoms moving forward. I think US analysis within the State Department and in Tunisia has largely been weak, tepid, and misinformed, and insultingly divorced from Tunisians' lived realities, as the State Department statements after Saied's sham elections recently show. And I just wanted to say that there have been a number of coups in recent years in Myanmar and in various African countries, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali, Chad, Sudan, Niger, and you can take the Department of State's readout on any one of those coups and read them almost word for word and apply them to Tunisia. Ironically, on February 2nd, earlier this month, the exact same day that the State Department spokesperson called Tunisia's most recent sham elections another step, quote, another step in the important and essential process of restoring the country's democratic checks and balances, he also made a comment about Myanmar. He said, the Myanmar military staged a coup d'etat and seized power against the will of the people, plunging the country into a deep political, economic, and humanitarian crisis. Over the last 2 years, the people of Myanmar have courageously demonstrated their commitment to a democratic country, demanding respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, et cetera, but the military regime has violently cracked down on any form of opposition, including peaceful protest. You could copy and paste that basically for Tunisia, except instead of saying the military regime, saying the presidential coup regime or the military and Ministry of Interior supported presidential coup regime. So there's really been diplomatic malpractice at multiple levels in the Biden administration. Say one thing about China involvement, it's worth remembering that the vast majority of Tunisia's trade is with Europe. Over 85% of its foreign direct investment, over 70% of its trade is with Europe. All of the logical indicators indicate that Tunisia is very, very reliant on its relations with the European Union. It's not the easiest of places for China and Russia to gain a lot of ground very quickly. In September 2021, Israel opened a Chinese-operated port in Haifa. The sole specific justification I've heard on this new Cold War great powers paranoia from members of the Biden administration to justify our genuflection to Kais Saied's new dictatorship is the possibility that China will make a bid for the Rhodes port at some point within the next 10 years. China already has to operate the port in Israel. It's very ironic. Is this worth it? Is this worth sacrificing the freedom and dignity so hard won, the democracy so painstakingly woven by Tunisians? I would argue it resoundingly is not. And one final point, Saied is not merely resurrecting Ben Ali's police state. He's radically re-envisioning state-military relations in Tunisia. He's trying to make Tunisia a military-supported presidential dictatorship like its neighbors. He's doing something radically different and very, very dangerous. So any military aid we give to Tunisia, let alone the counterterrorism funding, we need to subject to Pentagon, congressional, and Department of State oversight with that recognition in mind.
Thank you, Monica. I want to give the mic to Munji Dawadi. He's the president of the Tunisia United Network. It's a Tunisian organization that has been very active lately in Washington, D.C. Munji, welcome. Are you?
Yes, Radwan, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Go ahead,
Excellent.
Munji.
Thank you. Listen, first of all, thank you, Radwan, and thank you, Saied, for putting this together. Thank you for actually bringing these speakers, because they are, when we listen to them, when we listen to their analysis, and we kind of, we feel validated when we are frustrated when we are talking to the American officials, especially at the level of the State Department, or even the U.S. Embassy in Tunis, which I had for the first time the chance to talk to them today at 3:30 a.m. The reason for that, TUN represents Tunisian Americans. We don't represent all Tunisians. We represent a group of Tunisians in the U.S. who are opposed to the coup. We made several attempts. We made several attempts to talk to Joey Hood, to meet with him before he goes. He went silent on us. We campaigned for this guy. We talked to Ted Cruz, who was holding up his nomination on Congress so he can get through. And he refuses to talk to us for I don't know why. This is something that we face, and it's a bias maybe, because there's a perceived notion that Munji or anybody like him are close to Nahda, or they're tainted by the Islamist title. I don't understand. I'm frustrated, but we're gonna keep pushing. We're gonna keep exposing the incompetence. We're gonna keep exposing the personnel that Shadi Hamid talked about, of people who don't care about democracy in the Middle East. They all don't believe in democracy in the Middle East, and others, who working at the level where they're supposed to at least deliver facts as they are. People don't listen to the discourse that Saied talks about. I don't think they even translate or even understand the level, the hate, the polarization. Tunisia right now is all the preconditions for a civil war are there in Tunisia. We have one man who has all the power in his own hand, and he's sowing, hate and insults his opponents at any level, at any chance he gets. And he moved to a more aggressive approach, throwing people in jail, beating them up as they are arrested, even if they are leading one of the most organized political parties. To capture Bahiri and beat him up to the point where he breaks his arm, and to throw a former head of government in jail for 2 months with no clear charges, to charge people just based on the fact that they are talking to each other. All the international community was asking from the opposition in Tunisia is to have a discourse, to present an alternative roadmap, to bring the opposition together. That's what Khayyam Turki has been doing. And now he's charged with treason. And now he's charged with conspiring with a foreign country, as if the US is an enemy of Tunisia. This is how Saied is treating the US. I'm not sure if the officials in the US government are getting these messages. And so for me, giving him the IMF loan, just like Monica said, is just empowering Saied to even crack more on the opposition and throw them in jail and do even worse than what Ben Ali has done. So I just wanted to get in and thank you, Radwan and Saied and all the panel for speaking truth this morning. So thank you.
Thank you, Munji. Before we go to a last round of answers and comments by the panelists, starting with Ricky, I want to read a question or comment that we received from Jawhara Atis. Many of you know Jawhara was one of the founding members of the Constitution. She was a member of the Constituent Assembly. So here's what she is writing, and I want you to maybe perhaps comment on that. as a Tunisian citizen, I do have an impression that the US prefers to have one-man rule in Tunisia rather than a participative government. It is easier for the US to get its interests served by exercising pressure on one man rather than exercising it on different parts of the government. That is why I'm so pessimistic, and I do not expect anything from the US administration to help restore democracy in Tunisia. And I'm hearing this from many other people, by the way, in Tunisia, who are telling me that the support that the military is giving to the coup since July 25 would have been impossible without the tacit approval of the US administration and military. So they think that the US is tacitly supporting this coup and really does not care about democracy in Tunisia or elsewhere in the MENA region. So I know it's very disappointing to all of you. It's very disappointing to me. If this is or turns out to be true, I still have some hopes that it's not true. I still have some hopes that the US cares about democracy in Tunisia in particular, but in the Middle East in general. But, there are doubts, based on, the response so far to the coup. So I guess I want to end with this question. Do you think that the US cares about democracy in Tunisia? Do you think that US has given up on democracy in Tunisia and believes that supporting dictatorship serves its interests, including in Tunisia? So that's my final question to you, and then all of you, please answer anything else you might want to answer to the questions. We received a lot of questions from our audience today, so feel free to answer any one of them that you received in the chat or in the Q&A. We'll go ahead and start with Ricky. Ricky, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks. It's running late, so I'm going to try to be brief. First,
yes.
The question you just posed, Radwan, is the one that I asked at the outset of my presentation. Is there a Tunisia exception to supporting dictators across the region? And I argued that there was such an exception within limits. It's being sorely tested right now. The evidence is very discouraging, as our panelists have mentioned. As for the Egypt comparison, I think Monica laid out very clearly that we are not looking here at one of the authoritarians who are, classically, he or she is a son of a gun, but he's a keeper, he's our son of a gun. We're looking at somebody who's destabilizing and, whose future is less certain than somebody as entrenched as Sisi, on the one hand. But when the US makes these kinds of calculuses, it also looks at the alternative. If this person were ousted, what's going to happen? And I would argue, I think it's self-evident, that the alternative in Tunisia is far less threatening to the US interests as it is in many, many other countries, including Egypt, as the US perceives it. So it's both sides of that equation. The other point that I wanted to make, Radwan, is again where you started, which is to describe the current dire situation of the last week or so in Tunisia, because since the power grab of July, there has been no watershed human rights atrocity like Rabat Square in Egypt. The Tunisian police have not gunned down protesters and so forth. There's been an arrest here, Bahiri over there, and it's been hard to get a handle on it because the civil societies continue to act and there are protests in the streets, dégagés and so forth. It's been less palpable, but I think this weekend is a watershed moment, the last few days, where it's absolutely clear that we're heading down the slippery slope, and the president has removed everything to grab onto over the last year and a half. He's dismantled the guardrails. So if there ever were a moment for the US to speak very clearly, it's overdue, but it should be right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky. Let's go to Sharon, please.
So first,
any concluding remarks or answers?
Yeah, so 2 quick points. First, I think there are some in the administration who still do care about democracy in Tunisia, but they're being drowned out by other voices who are making a strong argument that we have other interests, security cooperation, great power competition, and so on. And I think those counter voices are only going to grow in the next couple of months. Now that a parliament has been elected, the military will withdraw from the parliament. I think those that are arguing that the US should just move on, go back to business as usual, those voices are only going to grow louder moving forward. So I'm quite pessimistic that you would see a change in US policy. But where I think we might see some reaction is, as Mungi and Ricky are noting, this growing rhetoric from Saied that is almost genocidal, where he's calling the opposition cancerous cells that need chemical methods to get rid of, that he's going to purge and cleanse the country. This, if it happened anywhere else, we would point to this, that this is genocidal rhetoric, right? When Gaddafi said this, the US moved. Likewise, I wonder if, as this happens, as Eric noted, there hasn't yet been an Rabaa massacre, but if something violent happens, right? We know Kais Saied's predilection, for instance, for the death penalty from his campaign in 2019. If there is something like that, devastating as it would be, that might be what gets the US to move. But at that point, it's too late. We need to keep pushing now to get the US to switch.
Thank you, Sharon. Let's go to Monica. Monica, any final concluding remarks?
Well, you know me, I've always got remarks. I'll keep it brief.
Yes.
I agree with Ricky that Saied has demolished the guardrails. The emergency exit is still vaguely in sight, but we're quickly hurtling towards a situation where the only exit might likely be a bloody exit. And we need to take that reality on board. As I said, we're baby steps away from Ben Ali in the 1990s, or something that very closely resembles Egypt in 2013. Kais Saied is a destabilizer. I think if folks within the Biden administration, European Union, or other governments are fed up with the values conversation, think that's too fluffy, and want to get down to brass tacks and only talk about security and China, Russia, great power competition, I'm happy to have that conversation. I think Saied is a losing bet on both issues, as my comments, I think, made very clear. The US Embassy has been divorced from Tunisians' lived realities, and it, in cooperation with the State Department in Washington, D.C., has been systematically releasing statements that insult the dignity of Tunisians across the ideological spectrum. The US, instead of meeting with Saied's opponents and not doing high-level photo ops, let alone getting garlanded by Saied, has been doing the exact opposite. In a bid to please Saied, the US has mystifyingly been meeting with him and his henchmen, but not been meeting with the opposition. A lot of the people who are being arrested right now are being arrested, or more accurately, abducted and kidnapped from their homes as we speak, in part because they've been meeting with Americans. We need to recognize that, and we need to keep the lines of communication with these Tunisians and with Tunisians across the ideological spectrum open. We shouldn't be a self-castrating giant that gets intimidated by Kais Saied so much that we won't even meet with the opposition. I'll just read you a couple of the charges against Abdelhamid Jalassi, who was a retired ex-member of Ennahda, who actually left Ennahda a few years back because he didn't think that its leadership was democratic enough. And he's been living kind of the life of a nerdy retiree and making Facebook posts and writing books that, frankly, only his closest friends and family will probably ever read. But he was dragged from his home on Saturday. His lawyers got the charges. They include one time he ate at a fancy restaurant with foreign researchers. He once had a coffee with Hayam, Turkey, the man you mentioned, Radwan. He stated in a radio interview that he's against Saied and the coup. These are the sorts of ridiculous reasons that, if the situation weren't so tragic, would be absolutely comical for why so many people are being dragged from their homes, many of whom were tortured, raped, subjected to horrible abuses for decades under Ben Ali, and now they're being re-traumatized, re-victimized. What's the alternative? I think this is one of the questions that folks within the US government ask out of laziness. I think the China-Russia pretext isn't a genuine, sincere pretext. I think it's a lazy pretext. A lot of people have given up on doing the hard work. They've given up on going out in the field and having meetings with Tunisians across the spectrum and thinking about what their real jobs are. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative is not genuflecting, bowing down to Saied with our statements until Tunisians magically create a unified platform. No, the alternative is respecting Tunisians' dignity enough to allow them to at least not block them or stand in the way of them potentially resurrecting a form of government that enables them to vote out people they don't like. We call that system of government democracy. And it's still the system that polling strongly shows the vast majority of Tunisians want. And the United States government, my US taxpayer dollars, are currently standing in the way of it. I'm sorry that Jawhara made the statement she made. As an American and as a longtime scholar of Tunisia, it breaks my heart, but I very much understand why Tunisians are losing hope in the way that they have. I can only hope that, as Sharon said, we stay in conversation with the many people inside the US government who are not lazy, who are caring, and who are trying to do their jobs, and at least make the US not stand in the way of Tunisians' dignity.
Thank you, Monica. And now final comments, words from Shadi.
Yeah, so on Jawhara's question, which I think is a sad but also essential one that we should think about, I'll say this. Knowing many of these senior officials and interviewing them in depth, including on these issues, they are not, for the most part, malevolent. In fact, the vast majority are not. They don't wake up in the morning and think to themselves, how can we find new ways to make the lives of Arabs miserable? And let's find more ways to force them to live under dictatorship. I think that's part of what makes it challenging. And I think a lot of it is neglect. And a lot of it is just having other priorities and they allow everything else to be subordinated under that. I mean, this is Jake Sullivan's position, which is everything is great power competition. And even if there's the smallest hint of risk that the Middle East could distract us, we can't do it. We're not going to even think about it. We're not going to put resources into it. We're not going to even ask other people to put resources into it. Does that make him a bad person? I don't think that's really the best way of looking at it. The entire structure of American Middle East policy is rotten. And that's what fundamentally has to change. And until it does, and so someone asked in the chat, well, something to the effect like, well, it's kind of hopeless. And I mentioned the prophetic hadith, tie your camel, I guess this, applies obviously to Arabia, but, tie your camel and then trust in God. That's the most we can do. We tie the camel, and whether someone else comes and cuts the cord or steals the camel is outside of our control, but that doesn't mean we stop hoping and stop trying. And my hope is actually not so much about the next year or two. My hope is the next 10, 15, 20 years, a new generation of policymakers, a new way of discussing and debating these issues, a serious conversation among Americans about reorienting our foreign policy in a fundamental way. And we work to that. We work towards that. We make the arguments, we make the connections, we spread the word. And that's what even if we're losing hope right now in this very moment, which I don't think we should, but even if we are, it's the long game here that matters.
Yes, thank you very much, Shadi, Ricky, Sharon, and Monica. I think this has been definitely one of our best webinars that we have organized on Tunisia in the last year and a half. These are difficult times, as all of you have mentioned. I was much more hopeful a year ago or even 6 months ago that this could all be avoided, and that I was very confident that democracy is still possible in Tunisia, that the ingredients for a successful democracy in Tunisia are still there. But you know, the last few weeks certainly have been a major disappointment, and the position of the U.S. administration and the Biden administration has been a major disappointment to me and to all of us, I think, in terms of Tunisia in particular. But again, thank you very much for these very important presentations. We will continue our fight. We need to continue to work to convince policymakers in Washington and in other European capitals that democracy is not only possible in Tunisia and in the Middle East, but it's the only way forward. It's really the only way to solve these problems and to have more stability and to have progress and to have economic development is through democracy and through the democratic institutions, not through dictatorship. I don't know why we keep making the same mistakes that we've been making for 60 years, you know, and it seems like we never learn from our mistakes. We support dictators thinking that dictators will provide stability. What kind of stability have they provided in the last 60 years? They destroyed the Middle East. They destroyed their own countries. They destroyed their economies. They destroyed everything. And yet, you know, we keep making the same mistakes. It's really unbelievable and shockingly so that we are still, you know, we still haven't learned the lessons. But really, all four of you are doing tremendous job. Thank you very much for speaking up and for you know, helping as much as you can to bring more light and shed more light to what's happening in Tunisia and in the Middle East. And hopefully, you know, we can fix the U.S. foreign policy, and we can, you know, we can make it better. We can make it more in line with our values, with our principles, with our interests, but also with the interest of the region and with the interest of the people of the region. That's really the best way to provide stability and to provide economic development. Again, I apologize to many of our participants. I see there are still few questions that we haven't been able to answer, and also few raised hands, but we're way over our time. We're supposed to be ending 1.5 hours. It's been 2 hours, but it's been extremely beneficial and extremely rich in terms of ideas and suggestions. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to staying in touch with you soon, inshallah.